Hi ladies and gents. Tonight we wander somewhere older than time and softer than dreams. To a place where sandals slap stone floors, candles flicker low, and the only real drama is whether Brother Oswin remembered to feed the scriptorium cat. The flickering golden light of oil lamps dances across shelves of tightly rolled scrolls and slumbering cobwebs, casting shadows like quiet ghosts of forgotten philosophers. We find ourselves in Alexandria. No, not the modern port city crowded with taxis and questionable falafel, but the ancient one. Alexandria of Egypt, where the long-lost library whispered with the secrets of civilizations. A city where scroll storage wasn't just a housekeeping issue, it was nearly sacred. Now, the Library of Alexandria. You've likely heard the legends. Thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, of scrolls lining endless wooden racks, continually being copied, catalogued, read, then misplaced behind someone's lunch. Because for all its grandeur, the library, and all ancient libraries really, shared a single, relatable human problem. Nobody quite agreed on how to keep the scrolls in order. The earliest record keepers weren't too fussed about filing systems. In temples and palaces, scrolls might simply be tossed into baskets or tucked into clay jars. The idea of cataloguing was almost quaint. After all, when you only own 7 scrolls, 3 of them about sheep, you know where everything is. It's when your sheep scroll starts cozying up beside a treatise on Babylonian plumbing philosophy that things get murky. By the time we arrive at the famed Library of Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, collecting scrolls had taken on imperial overtones. Ptolemy I, a general under Alexander the Great, had begun stockpiling texts like a dragon with bedtime reading. Captains docking at the port were required to donate any books on board for speedy duplication. The originals naturally stayed behind. The travelers, they got a copy, sometimes, if the scribes weren't on their lunch break. But what does one do with a hoard of 400,000 papyrus scrolls rapidly breeding dust and existential confusion? Enter Callimachus, poet, scholar, and the librarian who squinted into this chaotic paper pile and invented the first known library catalogue. Called the Pinnaces, Greek for tables, this marvelous effort wasn't exactly a neat index card drawer, but it was a start. 40 or so volumes, meticulously listing works by genre, author, and subject. Like a well-behaved scroll Tinder, it helped you swipe right on Plato and left on fish salting manuals. Now, let's be gentle with Callimachus. No barcodes, no Dewey Decimal, just reed pens, keen eyesight, and a great deal of squinting. Even candles were precious, so most cataloguing was done by breezy daylight, unless you were lucky enough to have a scholarly cat sit on your notes, which, likely, happened regularly. Cats have always had opinions on how long you should stare at papyrus before giving them attention instead. In truth, the Pinnaces were ahead of their time. Catalogue entries even included short biographic notes about the authors. Imagine that. Amid the thrum of the ancient world, someone thought to jot down not just what a person wrote, but who they were. Of course, whether those authors ever consented to the airbrushed mini-biographies is anyone's guess. Diogenes of Sinope, noted cynic and alleged barrel dweller, specialty, shouting at people in markets. And yet, there was beauty in this effort. The care, the ambition, to create order, however fleeting, in a sea of knowledge. To label, with quiet reverence, the thoughts of a playwright long dead, or a mathematician whose theorems still rattled with logic. Every scroll, a piece of a mosaic that someone tried, earnestly, sleepily, to make sense of. Outside the library, time drifted slowly. sand blew against sun-baked walls. Inside, scribes adjusted their robes and muttered about how Archimedes kept going missing under A instead of M. Meanwhile, somewhere in the back, Brother Oswin's distant cousin scribbled notes by moonlight, his candle low, his fingers smudged with ink, unaware he'd just misfiled Aristotle under assorted. Don't worry, we'll find him. But for now, let the candle of thought burn low. The scrolls are tucked in for the night, and the stones of Alexandria are warm beneath your feet. If knowledge is a sea, then tonight you're floating on the quietest wave. Press that like button before your eyelids press themselves, and sleep softly, dear listener. We'll be up again with the scribes at first light, long before books collected dust on your shelf or tabs overwhelmed your browser. Knowledge came in neat little scrolls, rolled like cinnamon buns, minus the icing, plus the occasional beetle infestation. Our sleepy tale tonight floats through time to land softly in the ancient city of Ebla, around 2500 BCE, where the earliest known library started whispering its secrets into clay. Now, don't imagine library carts or stern librarians with tight buns and judgmental eyes. Ebla's library was more of a room filled with thousands of clay tablets, methodically stacked like the world's most breakable lasagna. Each tablet was inscribed in cuneiform, the written equivalent of organized chicken scratch, and baked into permanence to ensure that future generations could read business receipts and odes to barley gods without worrying about things like paper disintegrating or being inconveniently flammable. You see, clay was both the data and the hard drive. One slip, and there went your records of goat distribution. But, as it turned out, clay had a surprising advantage. It didn't burn easily. When fire consumed Ebla, accidentally of course, because that city was unfortunately as flammable as a haystack in a lightning storm, the tablets remained. In a twist of ancient irony, fire preserved the thing it was meant to destroy. Like if your phone exploded, but miraculously saved your vacation photos. And here's where things get cozy. While we don't have a Dewey Decimal System carved into the walls of Ebla's library, archaeologists noticed a compelling secret, a method. The tablets weren't scattered randomly like a toddler's toy box. They were grouped by subject. Diplomatic correspondence in one corner, economic records in another, and myths and incantations tucked somewhere between, whispering to the walls. Cozy, isn't it? It was like a very early Pinterest board made of dirt. Now, let's gently waft across the sands of time, perhaps by antique camel or wind-blown imagination, to the grand halls of Assyria's capital, Nineveh, under the watchful eye of King Ashurbanipal, sometime in the 7th century BCE. Now, Ashurbanipal was no ordinary king. While most royal types flexed their sword arms and measured their greatness by battle scars, Ashurbanipal whipped out his stylus and said, "Behold my library." And you know what? We're still impressed. His library housed over 30,000 tablets. That's roughly the entire memory of a Nokia flip phone. But don't let that dim your candle. What matters is how he organized them. Here's a little secret for your drifting mind. The Assyrians were early adopters of spine labeling. No, really. They inscribed titles or summaries on the edge of each tablet, so that when stacked, one could see what they were about without flipping them over. Efficient, and surprisingly modern, in a way that would have sent Marie Kondo into a grateful sob. And the cataloguing didn't stop there. Some even had pseudo-bibliographic tags, tablets that said something like Tablet 3 of 5 in the tale of the Epic of Gilgamesh. Imagine that. People 2,700 years ago were already struggling to keep a saga in order. The very first box set. Of course, all this required librarians. Not the cardigans and shushing type, but cuneiform scribes, highly trained, often temple affiliated, and spectacularly underpaid, if we're being honest. This profession required years of schooling in scribal academies, where students copied endless lists of symbols until they could recite ideograms in their sleep. Quite literally, as many of them seem to have stopped halfway through and accidentally immortalized their spelling mistakes forever, the ancient equivalent of falling asleep on your homework. One set of tablets even included what seems to be a practice exercise, where a student was meant to copy a list of signs and just gave up halfway through. I like to think of him resting his tired forehead on the clay, drifting off, unaware that thousands of years later, archaeologists would nod in sympathy and say, final season. What's remarkable is how these early methods, stacking by subject, edge labels, series markings, paved the path for cataloguing systems to come, all while wearing sandals and trying not to drop breakable tablets on their toes. So next time you're overwhelmed by a modern spreadsheet, imagine doing it in a steamy room with no table, no pen, no paper, and your writing medium prone to shattering if you breathe too hard. Ancient librarians didn't just organize knowledge, they endured clay dust, gods of thunder, and the eternal risk of foot splinters. And so, as we leave Ashurbanipal's impressive collection behind, lit by the flicker of lamplight and the gentle hush of unturned stone pages, let's follow the scent of scrolls and a whisper of Greek as we find ourselves gliding toward a place where papyrus blooms and scholarly ambition begins to rival the gods. Somewhere in the cradle of the known world, just as fig trees unfurled their leaves under Alexandrian skies and the Mediterranean reflected its usual shade of smug blue, something miraculous happened. A queue formed. Yes, an actual orderly line, without shouting or throwing of sandals, right outside the mouse-quiet halls of the Mausion, that grand complex tied to the Library of Alexandria, like an overly intellectual twin. Local scholars, itinerant philosophers, and visiting dignitaries learned to take a number, so to speak, because inside those scroll-laden chambers, access to knowledge was suddenly not a matter of chaos or charisma, but of catalogue. And who do we have to thank for this subtle revolution in information wrangling? An unassuming, detail-obsessed man named Callimachus of Cyrene. Now, Callimachus never conquered a city, nor was he known for epic feasts or volcanic romance scandals. His great love was classification. Some have claimed he alphabetized his own dreams and corrected punctuation in casual conversation. Legend has it he once resorted the spice jars at a banquet because the thyme was tragically next to the honey. To the untrained eye, Callimachus would have looked like any other Alexandrian scribe, clad in linen, calmly squinting at papyrus, with ink stains dotting his fingers like the constellations he cared little about. But where others saw chaos, scrolls stuffed into crude pigeonholes with nothing more than gut feeling and dust, Callimachus saw potential. He saw order. He created the Pinax, a word that translates roughly to tables, though there were precious few flat surfaces involved. The Pinax were more like giant scrolls about other scrolls, an index of indexes, the librarian's treasure map. It covered authors, subjects, titles, and even, be still, my heart, where you might actually find the thing in the vast and echoey library. Picture a papyrus roll longer than your standard crocodile. Tens of thousands of works cited across 120 volumes. A true feat of meticulousness powered by sheer bibliographic determination and an allergy to disorganization. Callimachus, of course, didn't work alone. He presided over a team of scribes who probably got frequent papyrus splinters and developed permanent squints from peering at other people's worst handwriting. Together, they drafted tidy entries like Homer, epic poetry. See also celestial disasters, strange sea creatures, men yelling. Well, not in those exact words, but the essence was there. Their work meant that finally, a visiting scholar wouldn't spend 13 weeks looking for a single play by Sophocles, only to discover it was under T for those dramatic tragedies. Scholars could now waltz in, whisper to the desk scribe, "I'm seeking anatomical treatises of Herophilos," and be directed to scroll bin 42 without anyone fainting from frustration. Of course, not everyone was thrilled. Some bristled at their works being squeezed into categories. "My treatise is both astronomy and theological metaphor," they'd protest, wringing their ink-blotted togas in despair. Others didn't appreciate being told they were Nowacha 73 on a list of 249 or being placed under miscellaneous, the literary equivalent of the junk drawer. But Callimachus didn't mind. He adored the quiet power of structured knowledge, and while others dreamed of glory and garlands, he pored over manuscript metadata like a monk with insomnia. He famously once declared, "A great book is not always a long one," which is how we know he definitely never tried to finish the Pinaques in one sitting. Centuries later, whispers of his work would reach Renaissance scholars grappling with growing book collections and headaches over where to shelve Aristotle. Dewey would come along with decimals, Melville with an odd spelling of Melville. But they all unknowingly borrowed from Callimachus, the man who dared to sort the unsortable. And so the quiet marched on. A world catalogued, a chaotic cosmos coaxed into comprehensible drawers. As Alexandria's waves lapped against her librarian steps and oil lamps danced beneath marble arches, all was momentarily in order, until someone misplaced Archimedes under plumbing. And that, dear dream traveller, is when things began to spill over. Let's press further into those scroll-stuffed hallways, where knowledge grew too wild to tame entirely, and clever hierarchies began to twist like ivy. Nestled between the ochre columns and fading scrolls of ancient Egypt, a curious scene once unfolded. A scribe sneezing uncontrollably into a stack of papyrus, cursing the desert dust while trying to remember whether Decree number 189 belonged under royal proclamations or trade regulations weirdly specific. Because you see, while we often think of ancient libraries as solemn, hallowed halls of papyrus wisdom, in practice they were also labs for a grand, sleep-inducing experiment in organization. Welcome to the House of Life in ancient Heliopolis, one of the oldest temple libraries known to dusty scholarship and wandering cats. These houses of life, or per ankh, weren't just bookish hangouts for priests with excellent penmanship. They were a superbly bureaucratic fusion of hospital, word museum, and spiritual DMV, with very, very strict ideas about where scrolls should live. Though the Egyptians didn't have a card catalogue or the Dewey Decimal System, they were already miles ahead in the business of cataloguing by vibe. Scrolls with medical incantations, right side beneath the sacred ibis statue. Astronomical lore, back shelf, third cubby down, past the spooky one-eyed juice vendor who may or may not be a priest. Even the layout of the scroll storage cabinets, often made of wood or clay and referred to as library chests, was strategically designed. You didn't just toss a letter from the pharaoh next to a charm for curing snakebite. That would be pure madness. You see, the ancient Egyptian understanding of order was both spiritual and practical. Things had to be in their rightful place because the cosmos, held together by Ma'at, the goddess of balance and harmony, rather insisted on it. Disorganized scrolls that could tip the cosmic scales, unmake the stars, and worse still, annoy a very overworked temple librarian. It's believed that each scroll had a designated title, written either on the outer casing or at the beginning of the text. Rather than numbers or categories, titles were often descriptive. Think, spell for preventing a snake from looking at you rudely, or hymn to Ra sung, during that time of year when sand gets absolutely everywhere. Scholars suggest some cataloguing was done with stylized marks or symbols, perhaps sorted within coded cubbies. Only the initiates, or clever cats, understood. And don't overlook the fact that scribes had a kind of bureaucratic reverence rivaling modern tax collectors. They didn't just write. They curated, copied, sorted, and whispered about misfiled medical treatises like juicy gossip at temple lunch. Ah, the temple lunch. Hardened lentil porridge, maybe a leek, and wild speculation over whether scroll 7b was mistranslated or simply cursed. Stories ripple through time about important texts being lost or jumbled, sometimes spawning entirely new schools of magical misunderstanding. One poorly filed recipe for anti-baldness cream ended up in a funerary hymn, causing a generation of high priests to anoint corpses with goose grease. Historical confusion, sure, but plump, glossy mummies, unparalleled. Now, transporting yourself gently first into one of these scroll-filled chambers, you might imagine the faint ambient hum of reed pens, the scratch of stylus against palm fiber, and a vigilant overseer assuring that no one, absolutely no one, filed the book of breaths under tourism brochures. They even had something resembling checkout systems, though not the bar-coded efficiency you may know. More like, I whispered your soul's worth to Thoth, god of knowledge, and he says you can borrow this scroll if you return it before the next flood season. And lest you think cataloguing was entirely joyless, be advised that the ancient Egyptian sense of humor occasionally made its way into marginal notes and commentary. At least one scroll includes a wry jab at lazy assistants. He who fails to find the scroll seeks with his feet, not with his eyes. Burned harder than a failed offering in a windstorm. So if tonight you find yourself lulled by the hush of styluses and dust motes in divine alignment, picture that ancient library alcove, somewhere in time's long sleep, where a sleepy scribe yawns, then carefully reshelves the comedic wisdom of a lunar calendar next to an ancient fish recipe, simply because the scrolls were the same length and, well, it looked better that way. Filed under almost alphabetical. And now, as the torches flicker low and the cats resume their patrol for knowledge, and mice, let us shuffle like quiet sandals toward the next curious chapter of contemplative cataloguing in the ancient world. While the world outside huffed and puffed and occasionally stabbed each other with bronze spears, somewhere deep within the beige and tan serenity of early Mesopotamia, a man named Enlil Marduk sat with a reed stylus in his hand, debating whether divination's goats should be filed under animals, mysticism, or his personal favorite, things that get weird after sunset. Welcome to the quiet drama of Sippar. Yes, drama, but the Mesopotamian kind, where someone misplacing a clay tablet was grounds for strong tea and sighs of profound disappointment. In this gentle city along the Euphrates, around 2000 BCE, the Temple of Shamash wasn't just a place of sun worship, but a surprisingly sophisticated knowledge hub, a proto-library, if you will. Walls of baked clay cubbies housed thousands of cuneiform tablets, neatly arranged, or at least vaguely herded like sleepy sheep into thematic groups. You see, long before the Dewey Decimal System came in and caused a mild bureaucratic ruckus, librarians of the ancient world were already staring thoughtfully into the middle distance, whispering to themselves phrases like, well, we can put illness omens and star charts on the same shelf for now, unless Saturn objects. Now, Enlil Marduk, our theoretical scribe and perhaps the patron saint of moderately organized chaos, worked by soft daylight, categorizing clay slabs that were anything but light. Tablets then were squarish, lumpy, and the exact opposite of ergonomic. You didn't browse them so much as hoist them, like sleepy stone pancakes filled with wedge-shaped chicken scratch. The cataloging system, such as it was, fell to a combination of content placement, scribal metadata, and naturally, intuition. Tablets indulged their titles on the back or edge, handy if one knew what one was looking for, less handy if what one was looking for was buried under 172 undeciphered inventory logs of barley shipments. But there was method hidden in this broad brush, madness. Tablets would be grouped by subject and often by the scribe who'd written them. It was content organization with a flavor of bureaucracy and just a hint of deeply ancient exasperation. In one dusty corner of the Sipper library shelves, stone, mind you, not IKEA, there existed what we might call the dream logic section, full of incantations promising you'd banish evil spirits by mumbling secrets to a lump of pottery while standing on one foot. Enlil Marduk catalogued these not by deity or efficacy, but by degree of goat involvement, a frankly inspired rubric, though it never quite caught on. Occasionally, the scribes waxed poetic. One tablet unironically began, "For the aching spirit and the cow that moves when Saturn shines." It was a medical text, probably, possibly a weather forecast. Either way, Enlil Marduk flicked specks of kiln dust from it, carefully wedged it into the semi-plausible remedies section, and went back to his tea. Tea, by the way, was not so much drunk in Babylon as it was imagined wistfully. More likely, a bitter herbal stew occupied the cup. But let's imagine it as tea, gentle steam rising over stone windowsills, the scent mingling with ancient ink and thousand-year-old resignation. But the savviest twist of ancient cataloguing wasn't just the shelving, it was the table of contents tablets. These were small and unassuming, kind of like the footnotes of the Bronze Age, except made of clay and occasionally heavy enough to concuss. They listed what tablets could be found in a specific location. Think of them as primitive library maps, made before even the concept of second floor by the restrooms had been invented. Here's the thing though, libraries of clay were brilliantly future-proof. Fire, water, time, none of it stood much chance against baked silt and insane devotion. We still unearth these tablets today, often with fingerprints of the original scribe immortalized forever in the mud, along with what was possibly a pastry smear or two. So, if you've ever forgotten to wipe lunch from your Kindle, you're basically echoing a sacred ancient tradition. The gentle clack of stylus to tablet, a rhythm older than scrolls, older than parchment, older even than the dramatic pause before someone says, "Well, actually," in a university lecture. That was the undercurrent of Sipper, quietly insistent, stubbornly systematic, and just a little bit goat-obsessed. And beneath the slow-turning stars, as the night watch draped itself over the ziggurat stone steps, Enlil Marduk exhaled, nudged a particularly stubborn tablet into its place, and stood to stretch his spine with an audible pop. It was time for the cataloger to sleep, and perhaps to dream of simpler metadata, and one flawless, perfectly aligned shelf. Tomorrow, perhaps, He'd tackle the epic question of whether legal codes belonged next to flood myths or under light fiction. A gentle breeze tumbled across the sand as we drift softly onward, toward another collection in another land, where scrolls would slowly replace slabs, and librarians would learn the true might of alphabetization. As the sun baked the horizon, an ochre gold and sandalwood scent wafted from the scroll chests. A curious hum echoed quietly through the air of the famed library of Pergamon. This was not the sort of hum one might expect from chanting scholars or buzzing flies. No, it was the subtle, nearly imperceptible murmur of librarians, organizing, categorizing, whispering about codices like they were scandalous letters from a particularly salacious playwright. You see, while Alexandria often gets the red carpet rollout in the annals of bookish history, Pergamon was the quieter cousin who actually read the books on the shelves. Oh, Alexandria might have stolen a scroll or two, or entire fleets of them, but Pergamon, it refined them, filed them, softly tutted at the poor grammar and added footnotes where necessary. At the heart of this tidy empire of book management stood a stolid figure named Crates of Malice, an esteemed grammarian with a fringe beard, and an unshakable belief that words should know their place. Unlike his rivals, Crates considered the art of cataloguing not just an administrative duty, but a spiritual calling. If philosophy illuminated the soul, then organizing scrolls alphabetically by philosophical school surely kept the soul from misfiling itself into chaos. Crates devised elaborate systems, labeling the works of Theophrastus and Heraclitus with delicate ink and a judgmental eye. His system didn't rely solely on subject or author. No, he assessed the essence source of the scroll, mood, tone, perhaps the emotional weight of the syntax, and chose its shelf accordingly. A melancholy treatise on ethics would not, under any circumstances, be stored beside a light-hearted essay on urban sewage. He may have taken things a tad too far, as mentioned in a comedically dry parchment authored anonymously, but suspiciously in Crates' own handwriting, asserting that a misshelved scroll breeds intellectual vermin. It's unclear whether he was being metaphorical, or if this was indeed a complaint about the rats. But Crates wasn't alone in his bibliographic devotion. The librarians of Pergamon, who wore robes dusted with lint and the scent of vinegar-based ink, carried out the work with near mystical commitment. Each scroll was weighed, figuratively, and occasionally, literally, and placed into cedarwood cabinets with silk-lined compartments, because apparently some books deserved to nap luxuriously. Books were categorized under impressively specific classifications. Not merely geometry, but geometry solved before lunch. Not just drama, but tragedies featuring protagonists who should have just stayed home. There was even a brief experimental section for scrolls written entirely under the influence of fermented barley, though it was disbanded after several readers began seeing double after page 2. Librarians like Heliodora, famed for her stern whisper and ability to detect papyrus smuggled in under tunics, became folk legends. It is said that when the Roman proconsul visited Pergamon to ask for scroll recommendations on Stoicism, she handed him a single volume and said, "This one doesn't try too hard. You'll like it." Yet, perhaps most fascinating was the elegance with which these ancient library workers wrestled with a problem that even today's world, with its Wi-Fi and wearable translation devices, hasn't quite solved. How on earth to get people to return the books? Rather than overdue fines, Pergamon's librarians employed sharp, passive-aggressive notes tied delicately around a reader's sandals. No one quite wanted to explain why, but the mere sight of braided twine fluttering from someone's foot indicated shame, and also that they had a scroll overdue by at least 29 days and a festival. Still, the crown jewel of Pergamon's contributions was perhaps not its scrolls, nor its wattled pigeon messages about quiet hours, but its invention of high-quality parchment, also called pergamena, after the city itself. When Egypt rather unneighbourly refused to export papyrus, Pergamon turned a petty snub into a paper revolution. The new parchment was more durable, reusable unless the goatskin didn't cooperate, and had the added advantage of dramatically greater flop sound during theatrical readings. Scroll stewards began transcribing the classics onto this noble medium, forever altering not only how texts were preserved, but how script itself flowed. Elegant panther hair brushes gliding with newfound confidence along smooth parchment skin, like a cat composing poetry in cursive. And so, by moonlight and oil lamp, Pergamon's library did hum, not with noise, but with purpose. For while chaos may inspire the poets, it takes an organized shelf to help them find one another. Tonight, we let the shadows deepen as the librarians adjust their robes and reshelve Aristotle under things you said you'd finish, but definitely won't. And somewhere, just past the western wall of the archives, a new voice is beginning to whisper about a place where scrolls weren't just categorized, but copied with almost obsessive, inky devotion. While the great civilizations pondered the stars and scribbled prophecies onto goatskins, a lesser-known group of unsung heroes toiled in the dim corners of archives, where the deepest questions weren't about destiny or gods, but whether they should alphabetize the scrolls by the author's first name or by the city where they were found on a dusty shelf. Tonight, we slide gently into a quiet, papyrus-scented corner of ancient Pergamon, a city that gave Alexandria a run for its scrolls. While Alexandria's library bathed itself in mermaid rumours and bibliophilic grandeur, Pergamon's library stood steady up on its acropolis, proudly organised and smelling vaguely of sheep parchment and ambitious scholarship. The kings of Pergamon, particularly King Eumenes, who was both leader and bookworm, employed a little-known but critically sleepy group of librarians known quaintly as chartologoi. These gentle souls, armed with goose-feather pens and the kind of patience found only in people who enjoy alphabetizing things twice, were responsible for cataloguing thousands of scrolls. In the soft torchlight of their stone-lined sanctuary, they laboured evening after evening, a feather in one hand, a fig in the other, and possibly a deep sigh escaping their lungs with every duplicated title of Homer. The trouble, it seemed, was that ancient authors weren't especially creative with titling. One historian estimated that the Pergamon collection contained at least 43 separate scrolls titled simply On the Nature of Things, none of which agreed on what the nature of things actually was. Cataloguing these works grew into a surreal exercise. On the Nature of Things by Heraclitus, On the Nature of Things by, probably not Heraclitus, and On the Nature of Things, shorter but somehow even more confusing version. To complicate matters, scrolls didn't come with tidy book spines. Each parchment roll was layered tightly, its only hint at authorship being ink scrawled at the top, and even that could be smudged away by the moist breath of a devoted reader. So Pergamon devised a clever little invention, a kind of proto-sleeve, a tag tied delicately to the scroll with twine, bearing the author's name and an abbreviation of the title, like proto-luggage tags, but for philosophy and musings about wind. These tags, the earliest iterations of metadata, yes, even in 200 BCE, were lovingly called City Boy, an odd word perhaps. It rhymes with a sneeze and sounds inexplicably like a name you'd give a minor character in a Roman sitcom. But this tag, this city boss, would evolve into the future of cataloging, unique identifiers, file tabs, and every time someone has ever struggled with naming a file final, really final.doc, the actual whisper-quiet romanticism of the Pergamon librarians was not in their tagging skills, but in their collection habits. They maintained detailed records, titles, authors, subjects, even estimated roll lengths, all documented in humble wax tablets. These tablets formed the earliest known examples of what we could stretchfully call centralized cataloging, even more sleep-inducing. These cataloging tablets relied not just on alphabetical order, which hadn't been universally standardized yet, and thank goodness because Gamma always got too much attention, but also by theme. Thus, if one roamed the echoing corridors of Pergamon's library looking for obscure agricultural treatises, they could follow the wax tablets like a whispering trail. You might pass the Scrolls of Hesiod, take a left at Medical Papyrus Avenue, and find yourself deep among Fertilizer Philosophies, Section 4B. No library mice scurried here, just the occasional goat wandering in from the hills, confused but reverent. It was peaceful, methodical. Librarians would hum softly while sorting new arrivals, often engaging in the ancient equivalent of passive-aggressive footnotes. This scroll attributes itself to Anaxagoras, one wrote in neat Ionic script, but reads more like it was copied by someone drunk on plum wine and hubris. Classic librarian sass, the kind best appreciated under soft linens and swirling candle smoke. As quiet hours folded into quiet days, the catalogue grew. So did the challenge of preserving it. Wax melted, scrolls frayed, and every time someone spilled olive oil on the documentation, well, that was a whole seminar on its own, likely titled On the Fragility of Indexes Due to Snack Proximity. Still, the system persevered. Like a dream that kept getting rewritten on papyrus, the minds of these ancient catalogers bent toward order, not for glory, or even for footnotes in later tomes, but for the pure pleasure of knowing that, somewhere, a scholar could find exactly the right scroll about birdsong or irrigation, or why dreams smelled like lavender after heavy rain. And just as our eyes begin to feel like little clay lamps burning down to a flicker, we sense the curl of the next parchment, where the wax is still warm, and the scribes are preparing something entirely newer. Something with pages that turn, not unfold. Somewhere between the slow shuffle of sandalwood and the gentle creaking of parchment under the weight of centuries, there lived a particular breed of librarian. Not the sort who sternly shushed you, but the kind who politely hummed while alphabetizing 1,000 clay tablets by geographic relevance and favorable moon phase. In the brisk intellectual corridor of ancient Nineveh, a city that wore its dust like royal robes, the great library of Ashurbanipal steadily hummed along. Now, do not let the name intimidate you. Ashurbanipal simply had a penchant for collecting knowledge the way some collect souvenir spoons or small potted succulents. That is to say, with obsessive enthusiasm and almost no aesthetic organization. Yet, in the quiet corners of this Mesopotamian mega-library, there was structure. Not the sort that smacks of modern digital databases, but a softer, squishier kind of order. One that required intuition, memory, and a great deal of squinting at wedge-shaped markups in cuneiform. The cataloging method here was delightfully physical, a true embrace of analog inconvenience. Every tablet was inscribed with a final line, what modern catalogers might call a metadata tale. It read something like, Tablet 3 of 7 in the series, on the habits of wayward goats in springtime, followed by the scribe's name and a hopeful plea to the gods not to misplace Tablet 5 again. These tablets were then stored in shallow baskets or on low shelves, often with a tag, usually a small clay label tied with string through a hole. This tag, oh so lovingly pressed with a cuneiform summary, was the ancient equivalent of a library card. Although, instead of a quiet beep of a scanner, checking out a tablet typically involved a lot of muttering, mutual nodding, and occasionally a goat in tow. What made the library of Ashurbanipal, and cataloguing within it, extraordinarily unique was that it wasn't just about storing information. It was about cosmic preservation. Ashurbanipal fancied himself not just a king, but a sort of divine archivist, entrusted with guarding the secrets of the stars, the roots of herbs, and the proper procedures for summoning helpful spirits or banishing loud neighbors. And so, the catalogers, those silent, ink-stained dreamers in linen tunics, worked with solemn precision. They understood that every misplaced tablet was not simply an error, but a rupture in the great woven net of wisdom. They recorded, copied, and sorted with the kind of diligence that only comes from knowing your supervisor is both a king and occasionally a fan of public execution. Their system was not perfect. Copying errors were as common as crumbs in a toga. Some scribes had a flair for drama, abbreviating titles so ambiguously that readers spent hours deciphering whether Winds and Waters was a weather manual or an erotic poem. Spoiler, it was both. Still, their efforts mattered, because in this world where parchment was yet to be invented and ink hadn't quite reached its full smudgy potential, these clay-filled catalogues were the arteries of ancient knowledge. The quiet thud of one more tablet landing in its basket carried the sacred weight of continuity. Scholars would come, bearded, robed, and thoroughly convinced of their own importance, and leaf through tablets like whispering ghosts. They read about stars, about how to interpret strangely shaped livers for omens, and about the correct proportions for mixing honey with beetle wings to cure melancholy. Light bedtime subjects. Occasionally, biblical scholars debate whether someone in Nineveh first cornered the concept of indexing topics. The evidence, while vague, suggests that they at least invented the idea of a note to self with attitude. Some tablets included annotations such as recopied due to brother's error, or verify this with priest, seems suspicious, which is the ancient Near Eastern equivalent of commenting false, but go off, I guess. And if you're wondering how all this came to light, you can thank a delightful 19th century British chap named Sir Austin Henry Layard, who stumbled upon the ruins of Nineveh while, for lack of a better phrase, digging around for biblical props. Instead, he opened up a dusty tomb of knowledge so vast, it's still being decoded today. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? For now, let's leave the scribe mid-glance, poring over a tablet labelled Instructions for Peaceful Dreams, as his oil lamp flickers gently and shadows dance across the baked clay shelves. Sleep waits in the spaces between wedges and whorls, but mysteries continue in the catalogues of temples, and another empire waits patiently in the wings. Far to the west of dusty Mesopotamian tablets and dry Egyptian scrolls, there sat a collection of Stoic philosophers, basket-weaving librarians, and freckled scribes in ancient Greece, collectively unsure what in Mount Olympus to do with all this papyrus. You see, the Athenians, intellectual as they were, had a bit of a hoarding issue, but with ideas. Plays, epics, treatises, speeches, star charts, recipes for fig cakes, instructions on how not to anger a goat, very important, all teetering in scrolls stacked hazardously in shelves that didn't yet realize they were supposed to be furniture. These early Greeks had information, yes, but a system? Not exactly. Enter Callimachus of Cyrene, poet, scholar, closet neat freak, a man who looked at chaos and said, "What if? Alphabetical order." Now, I know what you're thinking. How terribly exciting. Alphabetical order. But in 3rd century BCE, this was as thrilling as inventing the wheel again. Callimachus worked at the Library of Alexandria, that mythic marvel of ancient knowledge, where it's estimated up to 400,000 scrolls lived quiet, papyraceous lives. It was essentially the ancient world's most ambitious attempt at a universal library, built with enthusiasm, conquered scrolls, and the occasional bribe to ship captains to surrender any text they happened to be carrying. But Alexandria had a bit of a conundrum. They could collect the knowledge of the world, but where precisely was that one bit from Euripides about goats, or the poem comparing olives to philosophers, or that astronomer from Babylon who wrote sideways? And so it was that Callimachus did something both tedious and revolutionary. He began writing a list. Yes, a list. But not just any list. The Pinaques. Not to be confused with pancakes, though both are relatively flat unless you crumple the former in despair. Pinaques means tables or lists, and Callimachus used this word to label what turned into 120 volumes of title, subject, authorship, and a handful of lovingly snooty opinions. Each entry might include the author's birthplace, the first line of the work, and sometimes notes like possibly terrible or died of excessive wisdom. Okay, perhaps I embellish, but only slightly. He divided the books into subjects: rhetoric, law, epic poetry, comedy, history, mathematics, medicine, and of course theology, in case you needed somewhere to file divine grudges. Biographies went in their own section, generously allowing ancient egos to remain neatly sorted. The Pinaques became the world's first library, catalogue, a dignified ancestor to what would eventually become card catalogues, decimal systems, and that strange, quiet person glaring at you for using your indoor voice slightly too loudly. Now, Callimachus himself didn't live to see his masterpiece take over the world. Much of the Pinaques was lost to time, eaten by fire, misfiled by fate, or simply worn away by idle, greasy fingers. But the idea lingered, like the faint whiff of ink or ambition. What made the Pinaques so enchanting, for those of us gently obsessed with taxonomy, wasn't its grandeur, but its precision. Its insistence that yes, even all of Homer's heroic blathering could live beside a recipe for lentil stew, so long as you knew whether to shelve it under epic poetry or snacks and philosophy. This was not just bureaucracy. This was the art of access. And for the first time, a scroll wasn't just an isolated murmur of knowledge. It was part of a fabric, a woven tapestry of thought, memory, and possibly incorrect astronomy. Some say Callimachus preferred smaller works, proclaiming, "A big book is a big evil." Others suggest he simply didn't like Herodotus, who, let's be honest, did have a habit of turning every anecdote into a 1,000-line epic on Persian shoes. Regardless, Callimachus's influence would ripple through the ages, not in a grand trumpets and marble sense, but like a library whisper, soft, orderly, persistent. And so in a quiet alcove in Alexandria, with the Nile lapping gently in the background and the scent of old papyrus permeating the still air, A man with too many scrolls and just enough foresight had invented something marvelously boring, the catalogue. And if you lean in just close enough, you might still hear Callimachus dusting off another scroll, sighing and muttering, "Oh no, not another Orphic hymn." Softly now, we turn from the whispered desks of Alexandria and drift eastward, where librarian monks in distant lands begin humming their own sleepy songs of cataloguing. When it comes to long-lost relics of civilization, people tend to think of golden idols, cursed amulets, or that one booby-trapped doorway Indiana Jones ran from. But hush now, for we are drifting softly into the plush cushions of a quieter treasure, the book list. Not the book itself, mind you, just the list of the books. And in the murmur of dim-lit history, there may be no greater list-maker than Callimachus of Cyrene. Now, you might not immediately leap to your feet cheering, "Oh, the Callimachus fan club meets again." But let's allow the slow magic of his genius to settle in, with the scent of old papyrus and ink crushed from soot and wine lees. Callimachus was not so much a librarian as he was the Beyoncé of categorization. Imagine, ancient Alexandria, 3rd century BCE. The city is humming with merchants, philosophers, and the occasional bored camel chewing on someone's hypothetical doctoral thesis left unattended. Nestled within this Mediterranean bustle lies the Grand Library of Alexandria. Yes, the one. A library so legendary, its destruction inspires more tears than most romantic comedies. At its ambitious peak, the library housed upwards of 400,000 scrolls. Some say more, some say fewer, some say nobody really counted, which is why Callimachus had to come along and sort the whole mess out. Our hero took a look at this tangled scroll pile and thought, with the quiet sigh of a librarian who's seen too much, big yikes. Instead of organizing the scrolls by color, tempting, or by scroll girth, frankly impractical, Callimachus penned an inventory known as the Pinax. That's Greek for tables, which is ironically the only object the library seems to have lacked for book stacking. The Pinax were no casual checklist. These were monumental work, over 120 papyrus rolls worth, each roll delicately battling humidity and hubris. Within these lists, Callimachus sorted the scrolls by subject: literature, rhetoric, law, medicine, natural sciences, and philosophy, each with subheadings, authors' names, summaries, and often sassy biographical tidbits. For instance, if a poet once insulted a respected philosopher, or had a penchant for overly long metaphors about cheese, Callimachus might scribble a polite note that read something like, "Author notoriously fond of dairy-based imagery, popular in some regions, less so in reality." You see, this was no dry filing system. It was a literary whisper network, tidily written in microscopic curly letters. In many ways, the Pinax were the world's first comprehensive library catalogue, a sort of ancient Dewey Decimal System. If Dewey wore sandals and quoted Homer while scowling at noisy patrons, although the original rolls have been lost to time and likely to negligent lantern placement, echoes of the Pinax survived. Later scholars admired its clarity, its structure, its astonishing patience. Imagine alphabetizing 400,000 Instagram captions without Wi-Fi. That's the fortitude we're talking about. Callimachus wasn't merely listing books. He was indexing human thought at a time when bookworms were literal, insects chewing through priceless knowledge with no regard for poetic structure. He also pioneered a principle that any modern cataloguer would echo with a gentle nod into their tea. Not everything belongs everywhere. He believed in the elegance of specificity, that a hymn to Apollo doesn't belong stuffed next to a treatise on irrigation canals, no matter how spirited the rainfall hymn might be. Sleep now, dear listener, and picture Callimachus hunched over a splintery desk in the Alexandria twilight, the air thick with jasmine and scholarly tension. Tiny lantern flame flickering beside a papyrus scroll, long enough to trample if you weren't careful. The distant sound of quills tapping and pages unrolling as knowledge slipped gently into order. Through the long night, by oil lamp and curious moon, he turned chaos into clarity, and not once complained that the ink kept staining his toga. Now let us sway gently forward, where ancient inventories met the mystique of sacred temples, and cataloguing took on a most divine sense of purpose. Walking softly into the misty corridors of the early Abbasid period, just as the river Tigris whispers past Baghdad's walls like an old librarian shushing a rowdy scroll, we find ourselves in one of the most organized places on earth. And yes, shockingly, it was filled with unruly paperweights and index lists instead of camels or conquerors. Welcome to the House of Wisdom. Not so much a house in your conventional 2-bed 1-bath sense, the Beit al-Hikmah, or House of Wisdom, was more of an intellectual beehive/manuscript buffet, where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian knowledge into Arabic over cups of mint tea, and possibly a few existential crises. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly the great Al-Mamun, fancied themselves patrons of knowledge, and nothing says we are serious about knowing things like funding teams of scholars to figure out why Ptolemy's map of the world put Scotland upside down. Now you must picture it. Polished brass astrolabes, faintly flickering oil lamps hung high in cedar-beamed ceilings, and long rows of low wooden shelves, cradling outlandishly valuable books copied painstakingly by hand. And beside them, pages, many, many pages. Not of text, but of lists. Yes, catalogues, indexes, ledger sheets with titles, authors, subjects, shelf locations, often more beautiful than the texts they described. Here, the art of library cataloguing began to take on something that felt remarkably modern and remarkably sleepy. The scholars of the House of Wisdom realized early on that managing a collection of thousands of books with no system was like trying to alphabetize camel names during a sandstorm. Chaos. So they developed something ingeniously simple. Book lists grouped by subject, sometimes even ordered alphabetically, though, confession, Arabic dictionaries at the time followed root patterns rather than the ABC method. So poetic, so confusing. Al-Mamun also had a charmingly obsessive tendency to commission indexes. If he heard of a book that didn't have one, he'd commission a scholar to write it. If he heard of a scholar who didn't own books with indexes, he'd probably look at them as if they'd shown up barefoot to a geometry lecture. The boring history part? Well, imagine being a 9th century scribe, hunched over parchment, copying not the Epic of Gilgamesh, nor the medical secrets of Galen, but 300 different entries of titles and authors, with footnotes like, possibly mistranslated, see loose goatskin near inkpot. A noble task, but maybe not one that quickened the heart. Still, there was beauty in it. These indexes preserved the foundation of organized knowledge in the Islamic Golden Age. They allowed scholars to cross-reference texts, trace concepts across ancient lines, and argue about whether Aristotle was slightly overrated. And it wasn't just Baghdad. Elsewhere in the Islamic world, in cities like Cairo and Cordoba, similar cataloguing feats were being undertaken. Mosque libraries and madrasas showed the same quiet ambition to make knowledge findable. In the library of Al-Hakam II in Cordoba, for example, the catalogue reportedly featured over 40 volumes just listing the library's contents. That's not the library, that's just the filing system. One wonders if, halfway through volume 26, someone leaned back, sighed, and asked whether this really was a good use of human handwriting after all. And names. Oh, the names. Some catalogues helped gather books by sprawling topics: mathematics, medicine, astronomy, poetry, logic, and what can only be described as miscellaneous musings, which might include philosophical complaints, etiquette for owl handling, or an extensive treatise on which fruit is the most theologically complicated. Spoiler, it's usually the fig. Scribes occasionally left tiny, whispered notes in the margins of these catalogues. Do not shelve near window, sunlight attracts ants, or author possibly mad, but arguments hold. These are the sweet nothings of history's sleepier epochs, and I cannot think of a more noble legacy than someone complaining about where the medicine scrolls ought to go. So we drift gently now, as the candles burn low in the shadowy corners of the House of Wisdom. The pages of the catalogue settle beneath our thoughts like soft woolen blankets. There, among the clove-scented air and the soft rustle of palm leaf bookmarks, our minds drift forward, toward a most curious scroll, passed secretly between readers, one that catalogued not just books, but rumours about who borrowed them. But that strange tale deserves the dimness of the next lantern-lit corridor. Let us now drift eastward, along the curl of dusty winds, to the vast oasis of learning called Gundashapur, a name that, admittedly, sounds a bit like a wizard sneezed while naming a city, but I assure you, was once the glittering jewel of Persia's intellectual crown. Gundashapur, nestled in the gentle belly of what we now call Iran, was a 6th century city where minds came to meet, argue politely, and sort scrolls alphabetically. It was home to a university, hospital, and library all in one breath, which, in ancient terms, was like combining Oxford, Johns Hopkins, and a really helpful tab on your browser. The Library of Gundashapur may not be as famous as its older cousin in Alexandria, but its contributions to cataloguing were no less potent. While the Greeks had their logographers and the Egyptians had their celestial inventory scribes, the Persians of Gundashapur had an approach that was, how shall we put it, efficiently elaborate. Imagine a scroll categorized under medical, digestive, camel-born, remedies, or perhaps mathematics, curiously imagined, Volume 2. The Persian system favored categorization by content and use, rather than by author or alphabet. This made sense at the time. After all, who had the time to learn the order of an alphabet when Avicenna-styled herbal knowledge was urgently needed for an upset stomach? Now, this system came with its own quirks. For instance, scholars began to lament a condition we'll call scroll shuffle, that delightful pastime of pulling 8 unrelated manuscripts before finally finding the one that tells you how to set a broken bone without offending the bone. Or worse, a bone's mother. The librarians at Gundashapur attempted to remedy this by introducing colourful tags to the outer chords of the scrolls. Yellow for philosophy, green for medicine, red for poetry, that rhymed a bit too well. You could say this was the world's first traffic light system for knowledge. Although, unlike modern traffic lights, these scroll tags did not cause road rage, but perhaps mild academic grumbling. And let's talk about those librarians. The quiet sentinels of the scroll stacks. Far from the stern spectacles we've come to expect, these librarians were often polymaths themselves, fluent in Sanskrit, Greek, Syriac, and the unspeakable dialect of footnotes. They hovered slipper-footed through the halls, correcting misfiled texts and occasionally muttering things like, "Ah yes, a Babylonian treatise on lunar irrigation, filed under theatrical arts, again." It is said that during the peak of Gundashapur's brilliance, students and sages travelled from distant lands, not for the cucumbers, though Persian cucumbers are delightful, but for access to its collections. Monks from China, Nestorian doctors, Roman mathematicians with sandals and opinions, all came to sip the honeyed tea of knowledge brewed over whispered conversation and candlelight. Though notably, they left very few sticky notes behind, mostly because sticky notes would not exist for another 1,400 years. And among all this human activity, the cataloguing systems itself evolved. A particularly enthusiastic scholar, whose name history cruelly forgot, once attempted to arrange the scrolls by mood. Picture it, a melancholy wing stacked with tragic epics and medicinal theories involving ash, a sanguine corner for love poems and sun worship manuals, and a morbid curiosity alcove where one might find rather specific guides on embalming techniques for small lizards. The attempt was noble. It was also a dreadful mess. Eventually, the elders of the library quietly rehomed those scrolls back into their more pragmatic categories once the enthusiastic scholar had, shall we say, been gently nudged toward a sabbatical involving goats and solitude. Yet it speaks to the very human instinct that runs through the veins of every civilization that has ever put ink to papyrus, vellum, or camel skin parchment. The desire to not only gather knowledge, but to arrange it, to place meaning next to meaning, to create little valleys of certainty amid the chaos. And so, as the oil lamps of Gundashapur flicker low and the scholarly murmurs soften to snores, we slip onward to a distant land, where clay tablets meet the intrigue of bureaucracy. Most people, when asked to picture ancient scholars deep in thought, imagine dramatic toga-clad figures pacing grand marble halls, occasionally pausing to stare intensely at a scroll, no doubt filled with eternal truths and cryptic prophecies. Few people imagine the damp smell of goatskin parchment, or the infuriating reality that an unlocked breeze could scatter one's entire collection of categorized scroll stubs across the floor and down a corridor, only to be chased midday by a frazzled junior scribe armed with hope and increasingly minor paper cuts. And yet, that is precisely what cataloguing involved in the vast archives of ancient Pergamon. Ah yes, Pergamon, not as famous as Alexandria, but to the bibliographically inclined, just as exciting, in a sort of quiet, ink-stained, dust-in-your-hair way. The Pergamon library sprouted in the 3rd century BCE within the kingdom of Attalid, gently nestled in what we now call Turkey. It wasn't built to match Alexandria entirely. That would have been impossible. Alexandria was the Beyoncé of libraries, but Pergamon was more like her introverted, brilliant cousin, who alphabetized their spice rack for fun. Here, on a terrace above the city, protected from the dampness of the harbour, and, perhaps more importantly, from the chaos of scroll chasing, a system of categorization began to emerge, one that acknowledged not only the content of a scroll, but the very unpredictability of scrolls themselves. Unlike our modern notion of book spines and card catalogues, ancient Pergamene scrolls were stored horizontally in cubbies, like literary baguettes waiting for their moment. To identify them, they used small clay tags tied with string to each end. Think of them as ancient ISBN numbers that could also chip your tooth. These tags were called silly boy, a word which tragically means that which is rolled, not a foolish boy, as hopeful historians initially imagined. The scribes of Pergamon developed clever systems using these silly boy. They recorded not just the author, but the opening words of the scroll, in case there were several works by the same name, the subject, and sometimes its origin. An early attempt at metadata, which we now take for granted when recklessly scrolling through streaming platforms at 2 a.m., hoping to just watch one more episode. But it wasn't simply about labeling. No. There were debates. Real, heated, ink-sputtering debates about whether Herodotus' histories belonged under history or fanciful rambling with occasional facts. There was an anxious scribe named Theopompos who reportedly spent 3 summers trying to decide whether a scroll about celestial navigation belonged in astronomy or philosophy. The stakes were higher than one might think. Misfile a scroll, and it may never be read again. Someone might live their entire life unaware that just one cubby to the left, a perfectly useful treatise on plague treatments, sat forgotten, simply because it mentioned the moon once and was thus shelved beside a lunar calendar. Of course, Pergamon's librarians weren't just ancient Dewey decimalists. They also pioneered the parchment revolution. While Alexandria clung to papyrus, prone as it was to moisture and the occasional library mouse party, Pergamon innovated with animal skins, what we call parchment or vellum. This had weight, durability, and a tactile satisfaction that frankly made them the Apple engineers of the Hellenistic library scene. But parchment had repercussions. Egypt, apparently peeved that their rival was now not only building a library, but also out-innovationing them in writing materials, allegedly embargoed exports of papyrus to Pergamon. An ancient version of fine, see if I lend you paper again. Well, the monks of Pergamon simply turned to more sheep and goats, a decision that no doubt puzzled the local livestock. As the system grew more refined and the animal population diminished slightly, Pergamon's librarians began copying popular works into their new parchment format. These lighter rolls were more portable, easier to store, and, in a pinch, probably more absorbent. They even developed a color-coded seal system to track the themes of scrolls: red for myth, green for science, ochre for political gossip. Those scholars later disputed whether ochre meant politics or just indicated an oily lunch that had gone rogue. And so, in the almost silent corridors of Pergamon's library, where each step echoed between shelves of arranged wonder, the ancient art of cataloguing grew more nuanced, more thoughtful, and, oddly, more enjoyably maddening. Now, as the scented wind of parchment and goat drifts gently by, let's pause and drift with it toward the next quiet chapter in the story of keeping track of what we know, and occasionally misplacing it. Just before dawn in Alexandria, before the sun had a chance to yawn its first light across the quiet city, there was a peculiar hush that drifted through the stone corridors of the famed library. Not the silence of unread scrolls, nor the sacred stillness of ancient knowledge, but a sort of patient hush, as if even the papyrus had paused to inhale. At the center of all this scholarly calm was a man with what might be considered, by ancient librarian standards, a flair for dramatics. His name was Callimachus, and though sadly lacking an Instagram account to document his quill work, he was the ancient world's closest equivalent to a head bibliographer/indexing influencer. Callimachus, son of Battus, had a problem, a scroll problem, or more accurately, a "where on earth did I put that scroll" problem. The Library of Alexandria, you see, was determined to collect every single piece of writing ever. It was a noble mission, in theory, but noble missions have a funny way of turning into logistical migraines. You might imagine the library's walls lined with neat little compartments and whisper quiet drawers. You'd be wrong. Scrolls were piled, stacked, and cradled wherever there was room. It was less organized than your average sock drawer. Some scrolls were in Egyptian, others in Greek. A few very confused pieces were in languages nobody there could actually read. But hey, knowledge is knowledge, right? So our friend Callimachus, perhaps in a moment of exasperated genius or caffeinated inspiration, decided to create the world's first true library catalogue. This was not a list on a chiseled tablet, nor a frantic stack of papyrus post-its. It was a document, lovingly titled the Pinnaces, which, if we're being literal, just means tables or lists, but we'll forgive the lack of pizzazz in the branding. The Pinnaces was a multi-volume catalogue of authors, their works sorted by genre, with brief biographies, essentially an ancient Goodreads, minus the star ratings and sassy reviews. It may not seem thrilling at first glance, but remember, in an age when writing things down was practically a luxury sport, this level of data organization was the intellectual equivalent of inventing the spreadsheet during the Bronze Age. Imagine a sleepy scholar pacing through the library, mumbling to themselves, "Now where did that treatise on sea cucumbers go?" Instead of flailing through 40,000 scrolls like a scholar in distress, they'd consult Callimachus's Pinnaces, flip to the appropriate table of zoological oddities, and, behold, they'd know exactly which shelf to stumble towards. Each entry in the Pinnaces gave you not just the name of the author and the title, but also a short note about them. Sometimes these were whimsical, sometimes a bit shady. Callimachus was not above a little ancient snark. There are rumours, and by rumours we mean scholarly speculation, after long afternoons of decoding ink, that he occasionally added opinions into these bios. For example, noting that an author wrote too much and too quickly, which is historian speak for, "This guy really should have edited." Not only did this catalogue help maintain intellectual order among chaos, it also ensured that scrolls didn't disappear into the footnotes of history. Ancient authors owed their legacies to this diligent indexing, as much as to their actual writing. Of course, the system had its quirks. Some genres were a bit fluid. The boundaries between natural science and mythical oddities were kept blurry, partly because no one wanted to argue about whether a phoenix counted as wildlife, despite the fact that the Pinnaces has been lost to time, like most good things including single socks and matching Tupperware lids. Its influence was quietly monumental. Every card catalogue, every library database, every school librarian with an unexpected sense of power in their barcode scanner, all owe a nod to Callimachus, and yet he was largely uncelebrated in his own day. No statues bore his name. Nobody wrote an ode to the man who could alphabetize 100,000 scrolls without bursting into tears, which is a shame, because if he were alive today, he'd probably be a power user on Zotero, whispering sweet metadata to his digital catalogue while sipping chamomile tea. So, as the stars faded above the pyramids and the library bathed in the first golden-green blush of morning, Callimachus set down his stylus, stretched the crick from his neck, and quietly filed one last scroll into place. As the morning light crept across those dusty shelves, something else began to stir. Deep within the stacks, a curious sort of parchment, and an even curiouser librarian. But that, dear listener, is a tangent best whispered in the next quiet chapter. Dust settled gently over the worn mosaic tiles of Pergamon's library floor, as a breeze flickered through marble columns and papyrus scrolls. like the whisper of gossip passed down through centuries. It was late in the afternoon, somewhere between scholars are getting peckish and someone really ought to light a lamp. Thoughtful footsteps echoed softly as a young librarian, whose name history forgot because frankly he never wrote it down, carefully rearranged a stack of scrolls, not because they were out of order, mind you, but because he believed one corner of the shelf was lying to him about its alphabetization. Pergamon, you see, had lofty ambitions. Their library was battling Alexandria for top bibliophilic bragging rights, thinking themselves stewards of the world's most well-catalogued scrolls. A noble feat, overshadowed only by their ambition to also outshine Alexandria in the department of literary suspense. After all, nothing builds tension like shelving Sophocles under S or under T for tragedy. The cataloguing systems in Pergamon were, for the most part, less chaotic than one might expect from a city that banned the export of papyrus in a fit of library-related rivalry. Scribes used tags made of parchment tied gently to scrolls with twine, each tag marked with a title, author, and what can only be described as early genre symbols. For example, a tiny drawing of a goat might indicate pastoral poetry, and a frowning face with thunderbolts drawn above it likely meant divine temper tantrums, mythology edition. But managing all this metadata came with its own brand of ancient headache. Especially troublesome was the issue of repeat titles. There were, for instance, a suspicious number of treatises on the nature of fire, leading librarians to label them with deeply personal annotations like "not that one" and "the one with the exploding amphora." To keep track of their growing collection, Pergamon scholars invented a rather charming system of pigeonholes. Literal wooden pigeonholes set into walls, each holding scrolls arranged by subject, then by author, then by whimsy. Some scholars protested that this was inefficient, to which the head librarian replied, "Yes, but it looks symmetrical from the atrium." Statues lined the hall, Plato looking smug, Aristotle looking judgmental, and beside one bust, a slab of polished terracotta served as the central index. Here, names and titles were etched ever so carefully by a designated inscriber, a man with heartbreakingly steady hands and a mustache that curled like philosophical questions. This slab wasn't just for show. It was the Dewey Decimal System of its day, minus the decimals Dewey, or any meaningful consistency. Libraries in Pergamon also employed what modern cataloguers might call scroll shepherds, assistants whose job it was to fetch and return scrolls in the proper cubby, and occasionally lecture scholars who tried to borrow things without signing the wax tablet guest log. Indeed, one scribe once tried to sneak off with an out-of-date astronomy chart, only to be intercepted by a particularly spry shepherd wielding a rolled-up copy of the Ethics of Comet Watching. Academic injuries were sustained, mostly to egos. And then there were the whispered tales of secret catalogues, hidden sub-libraries within the library, where forbidden or spiritually problematic texts were stored. These were mostly philosophical rants considered too spicy for state-funded thought. To gain access, one needed not a library card, but the right password, usually a pun in Ionian Greek. By torchlight, this system hummed along for generations, its quirks matched only by its quiet charm. A scholar might spend a delightful afternoon with Pindar, should they decipher that he was stored in a debate-worthy section labelled inspiration or arrogance. Fiction and non-fiction, of course, had no delineation, because in ancient Pergamon, even truth was poetic, and even poetry had footnotes. As the last scroll was reshelved and the bronze latch on the catalogue slab was softly clicked shut, a hush settled over the library, not from disuse, but the satisfying silence of good order. Flags fluttered high above the stoa. Pigeons, those unrelated to the shelving, cooed in the eaves. Tomorrow would bring new acquisitions, a scandalously long treatise on the river currents, and a dramatization of Plato's dialogues recast with sopranos. But tonight, the library slumbered, alphabetically, symmetrically, with a slight lean toward chaos under M. And so, with candles dimming and ink drying, let's wander further. For elsewhere, on distant scroll racks, clever ideas were blooming in secret margins. As the moon flipped the page from evening to night, let us wander once more into the fragrant folds of parchment past. Let your thoughts drift now to Pergamon. No, not Pokemon Pergamon. The ancient city nestled in what is now Turkey, where a particularly bookish battle was quietly brewing, with ink-drenched fingers and a touch of passive-aggressive library innovation. You see, back in the 2nd century BCE, the great library of Alexandria was the Beyoncé of libraries, glorious, revered, and keen on maintaining its status at the top of the intellectual charts. But Pergamon fancied itself a karaoke challenger to Alexandria's domination. Under the rule of King Eumenes II, Pergamon began building a library to rival Alexandria's overwhelming collection. Located in the Temple of Athena, it was rumored to hold over 200,000 beautifully scrolly scrolls. And yes, that's scrolly, as in loaded with satisfying curls that make your inner archivist sigh with delight. Now, as with many historical rivalries, think Newton versus Leibniz, cats versus cucumbers, or tea versus coffee, competition bred creativity, and occasionally petty sabotage. According to Pliny the Elder, who had a habit of writing absolutely everything down, whether it was accurate or not, the jealous Ptolemies of Alexandria supposedly banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon. Ah yes, papyrus, the Starbucks cup of the ancient world. Always available, occasionally unreliable, and found literally everywhere. By cutting off their papyrus supply, the Alexandrians hoped to stunt Pergamon's growth, a rather papery form of passive aggression. Undeterred and mildly annoyed, the scribes and scholars of Pergamon turned to an older medium, parchment. Invented earlier but perfected out of necessity now, parchment was made not from reeds but from animal skins, soft, supple, and surprisingly durable. Not only did it not crumble like papyrus when moisture hit, but it also didn't require living next to a Nile's worth of reeds to produce. This transition wasn't just an economic pivot, it was a cataloging conundrum. You see, scrolls had their own logic. They rolled. Their titles were attached to the outside. Think of them as ancient cereal boxes. Name on the outside, content rolled up inside, and sometimes a tiny toy scarab if you were lucky. But when you switch from scrolls to stacks of flat-bound parchment, suddenly you're inventing something closer to what historians would call a book, or, for the truly bold, a codex. This shift demanded new systems for tracking. You couldn't just line up your scrolls like Jenga blocks anymore. You needed to shelve things, label sections, and here's the kicker: create indices. And here's where the cataloging tango really kicks off. While our Alexandrian pals might have had their pinnaces, those marvelously meticulous library catalogues created by the poet Callimachus, Pergamon's scholars had the task of adapting and reimagining order within a new format. If scrolls were the mixtape of ancient literature, codices were the vinyl, records, harder to lose, easier to stack, and just screaming out for Dewey, if only he'd been born 2,000 years earlier. In short, the format influenced the filing. moving to parchment shifted not just how texts were made, but how they were stored, accessed, and catalogued. It's kind of like switching from VHS to DVDs, except instead of searching by genre, scholars sought instead to organize by author, subject, and sometimes for fun, ideology. One can only imagine the labels. Aristotle, the early years, Homer's hits, unknown philosopher, smells weird. Also worth noting, storage solutions evolved. Scrolls rested in pigeonholes, charming wooden cubbies that probably rattled mysteriously in the night. But parchment books, heavier and flatter, demanded new shelving techniques. Enter the vertical shelf, a revolutionary idea that was slowly adopted through necessity. No one wanted a cascading avalanche of Aristotle at midnight after all. And all of this, every rewritten shelf, every repurposed scroll rack, every bleating goat sacrificed for future parchment, was in service not of power or glory, but something far more quietly noble. Access. Cataloguing was and remains the art of making knowledge findable. No sirens, no spears, just ink, order, and the occasional bite from an angry librarian's goose quill. Of course, all materials decay and rivalries soften. One day, Mark Antony would give Pergamon's entire library to Cleopatra as a romantic gesture. Nothing says "I love you" quite like 200,000 dusty manuscripts and a tired army of ox-hide tanners. And so, parchment took its place in history's quiet revolution, silently reshaping how knowledge was preserved, catalogued, and offered to hands that sought to turn its pages. But before we drift too far down a parchment-covered path, there's another kind of binding we must explore. One not of leather or goat, but of rule and rank, as libraries began to confront the curious question of colonial classification. In the gently flickering lamplight of medieval monasteries, somewhere between the creak of wooden floors and the rustle of parchment, lived a peculiar breed of librarian, quiet, cowled, and perpetually surrounded by the smell of ink, wax, and whatever faint aroma is emitted by centuries of sleep-inducing theological commentary. These were the keepers of the scriptoria, those dim, contemplative rooms where monks copied manuscripts with all the thrill of watching paint dry. If the paint was suspiciously Latin, and the drying process took several weeks. The Middle Ages, you see, weren't known for speed. Not in their postal system, not in their warfare, and certainly not in their cataloguing systems. But slow, as it turns out, was an asset. When you're dealing with fragile manuscripts painstakingly inked by candlelight, slapped between wooden covers heavy enough to short-circuit your spine, and containing topics so abstract they could lull honeybees into hibernation. Well, misplacing a volume wasn't merely inconvenient, it bordered on heresy, and so monasteries devised strategies, some more functional than others, for keeping track of their precious tomes. The first, naturally, was to not let anyone borrow them. Problem solved. When your books are literally chained to their shelves, yes, chained, they tend to stay put. These chained libraries popped up everywhere from Zutphen in the Netherlands to the dusty corners of Oxbridge. It wasn't about distrust so much as it was about survival. A single missing manuscript represented dozens, sometimes hundreds, of hours of meticulous labor. And let's face it, if Brother Guillaume had to recopy the glosses on the Psalms again, we'd all be reading Psalms with a slightly sharper edge of passive aggression by now. The cataloguing system itself, however, required something a bit more cerebral. In monastic Europe, catalogues took the form of armaria, essentially glorified inventory scrolls. These lists were lovingly handwritten, documenting which volumes were kept in which cupboards, because yes, Books often had designated cupboards before libraries had designated shelves. Titles included such gems as Libellus contra Heresies and De Vita Contemplativa. Page-turners, if you were particularly devoted to contemplation. Books were often filed not by subject or author or color-coded sticker. No. They were grouped by height. Tall ones on one shelf, short ones on another. This was partly aesthetic, partly practical. It gave the storage a sense of gentle symmetry, like bookish topiary, and prevented the parchment siblings from leaning tiredly against one another, like monks after Vespers. Another favorite method? Marginalia. Not the juicy, scandalous kind you might hope for, like Brother Thomas keeps snoring during matins, or this passage contains subtle heresy, also sandwich crumbs, but instead, directional scribbles, notes in the margins pointing to similar works, or letters signifying the subject matter. These homegrown metadata poems were the ancestors of your Dewey Decimal System, in the same way that a jar of leeches was the ancestor to modern medicine. Not perfect, but earnest. The most committed cataloguers went one further, binding indexes to their catalogues, books of books about books, just the sort of infinite recursion that keeps a librarian up at night, if librarians ever got up at all. Elsewhere, in sunny Islamic Spain and the grand halls of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, book organization enjoyed a touch more flair. Catalogues, or firis, often contained short summaries and author biographies. Some were arranged alphabetically, and others by genre. Medicine, astronomy, jurisprudence, and poetry, carefully sorted like a cupboard of intellectual spices. And then there was the Caliph Al-Hakam II of Cordoba, who reportedly amassed over 400,000 books, an optimistic feat in an age before printing presses or ergonomic shelving. Historians believe he employed an entire team of scribes, readers, and catalogers to keep track of this bibliophilic behemoth. Imagine the checkout process. I'm looking for a book on surgical instruments. No, not that volume. The one with fewer bleeding diagrams. A quarter hour later, a pleasant apprentice arrives bearing a book and a sprig of mint for your nerves. However elaborate the system, regardless of region or religion, the goal was the same: a desperate and deeply human attempt to bring order to knowledge, to anchor learning in a world that constantly teetered between dust and divine mystery. And slowly, delicately, those practices would lay the groundwork for the next great leap, when libraries dared to shift from cupboards to shelves, from monastic treasuries to civic wonders, inching us ever closer to something resembling modern cataloguing, and perhaps a slightly better chance of finding the book we're looking for. But to understand how we get from parchment cupboards to public inventories, we need to make a small stop. Somewhere quieter still, where a 13th century Italian friar sits by lamplight, dreaming in decimals. Alexandria may have stolen the spotlight with her marble columns and book-hoarding tendencies, but if you tiptoe gently a few hundred miles to the east, preferably in your coziest socks, you'll find another lesser-known but lovely jewel of bibliographic innovation: the ancient library of Pergamon. Yes, Pergamon. Looming high up on a hill in Asia Minor, now modern-day Turkey, this breezy, stone-stacked marvel was once considered second only to Alexandria in the great ancient library rankings. A contest, sadly, never televised. The residents of Pergamon considered themselves learned folk, serious scroll sifters, parchment poets, and devotees of the Dewey Decimal's great-great-grandparent. Their library boasted some 200,000 volumes, scrolls, not codices, this being pre-book bookland. And these weren't scattered willy-nilly in dusty corners. Oh no, the librarians of Pergamon had panache. Scroll handbags? Maybe. But scroll organization? Impeccable. They even arranged their scrolls by subject, demonstrating a wistful yearning for order in an otherwise unpredictable ancient world, where plagues, oracles, and goats regularly interrupted your reading. Philosophical musings lived next to political treatises. Medicinal texts were separated from speculative theology, because no one likes getting their leech recipes mixed with eschatology. Now, to clarify, the scrolls themselves didn't have back covers with barcodes. Labeling methods were humbler, more linen-forward. Scribes typically tied a small tag to the end of each scroll, like a scholarly tale, with enough information scratched into leather or parchment to tell you what rabbit hole you were about to tumble into. The tags often included the title, the author's name, and occasionally a tantalizing line about the genre, like a dialogue in 3 parts on why birds are angry. Imagine browsing, corridor upon corridor of scrolls, resting in cubbyholes carved out of stone, or perhaps stored in wooden boxes lined with soft cloth. The smell would be of ink, dust, and a curious undertone of ambition, and perhaps goat, because, well, everything smelled vaguely of goat. Pergamon was also notorious for its rivalry with Alexandria, a feud petty enough to be stored on papyrus. According to delightfully mischievous legend, the Ptolemies of Egypt, Alexandria's book baron family, got wind that Pergamon was trying to out-library them. Scandalized, they took swift and entirely dramatic action by halting the export of papyrus to Pergamon, the ancient version of cutting off your neighbor's Wi-Fi. If one cannot scroll as fast as another, after all, what is the point of civilization? Unperturbed, Pergamon's scholars adapted like the bookish badgers they were, turning to animal skins, vellum and parchment. Yes, parchment. Not just a decorative stationery at your Renaissance-themed wedding, but a full-fledged innovation of necessity turned tradition. Cleaner, crisper, and far more durable than papyrus, parchment gave Pergamon the edge, albeit with fewer excuses for paper cuts. The process was a labor of love plus quite a lot of scraping. Young goat or sheep, skins were stretched on frames and scraped within inches of their fuzz. It was a tactile act of devotion to knowledge, and the result was a silky surface perfect for writing long, complicated thoughts about geometry, virtue, or household mold management. You might think from all this energetic cataloguing and rivalrous record-keeping that Pergamon librarians were constantly rushing about like manic squirrels, but quite the opposite. These folks favored the slow and steady. Reading nooks were abundant. Mood lighting came courtesy of skylights and strategically placed oil lamps. And while quiet was expected, the occasional snore from a dozing philosopher was tolerated with academic grace. Nowhere was this gentle pace more evident than in how Pergamon catalogued authors. Anonymous works were stored separately, under headings like Author Unknown or the dramatically vague On Origins. Works by grandmasters like Aristotle or Hippocrates were granted pride of place, but the librarians made room too for lesser-known writers with names like Lysicles the Inattentive or Diodorus Minor, whom no one could quite remember, but whose scroll on aquatic birds was surprisingly gripping. This careful balance of scholarly ambition and unhurried charm made Pergamon a marvel, a quiet kingdom of cataloguing perched on an overlook, watching centuries pass and pages turn. And while the scrolls did eventually fade, or find themselves tucked away in collections far from home, their whispery wisdom lingers, like the scent of parchment in an empty room, or the hush before you open a book that's waited ages just for you. Speaking of waiting, just beyond the horizon, there's another tale unfolding. one where medieval monks take up the baton, candlelight flickering as they squint at sacred texts and reinvent the footnote. But that, dear dreamer, is a story best reserved for a touch more moonlight. In the gloaming twilight of ancient Pergamon, as swirls of lavender dusk brushed the sandstone streets, a soft rustle could be heard inside the great library halls. Not the dramatic kind of rustle. There were no action heroes leaping about, no swashbuckling librarians, just the calming, perpetual shuffle of parchment against feet, tunics brushing against shelves, and the occasional creak of an overburdened cataloguing table. Pergamon may not have boasted the mystique of Alexandria's vast sylvan scrollscape, but it was nonetheless a city that took its papyrus quite seriously. Once it acquired something to write on, that is. You see, Pergamon's library, a marvel of Pergamene ambition, was built during a rather sticky diplomatic situation, one in which Egypt, protective of its papyrus exports, politely told them to find another life choice for their library building endeavors. And so necessity once again packed her bags, borrowed cleverness's sandals, and created an innovation. Parchment made from animal skin, stretched and scraped until it was smooth enough for scribes to impress upon it their carefully inked complaints about the price of olive oil. With parchment as their partner and ambition as their fuel, the librarians of Pergamon set out to build a collection so vast it would induce papyrus envy. But, as any reasonable scroll hoarder will tell you, it's one thing to collect texts. It's quite another to remember where on earth, or Hellenistic Asia Minor, you put them. Thus began the uniquely tedious spectacle of cataloguing in Pergamon. One might assume librarians kept to dusty corners, but no, here they were celestial navigators of knowledge, armed with wax tablets and a tendency toward obsessive neatness. They created shelf lists, early inventories of items stored in a particular place. The shelf lists were hand-scribed on tablets that matched the shelves themselves, not sorted alphabetically, as that would be far too modern, but often arranged by subject, author, or mystifying scribal hunch. Imagine a low wooden bench, warm from the sun, inhabited by an elderly librarian named Diogenes, who refused to let anyone reshelve the works of Herodotus without his approval. His catalogue tablet, a thing of beauty, neatly inscribed titles like On the History of Embalming, followed by a small triangle symbol meaning scroll requires drying. There were also symbols designating if a scroll was singed, smudged, or tragically eaten by the library's unofficial goat, Unimos. These catalogues weren't just internal tools. In some remarkable moments of bureaucratic generosity, libraries shared their catalogues with other institutions. The librarians of Pergamon and Alexandria found themselves in a slow-motion game of literary one-upsmanship, with messengers trotting scrolls and catalogues between cities like intellectual carrier pigeons, with less flapping and more foot blisters. Still, misunderstandings bloomed. In one particularly amusing incident, Pergamon had sent for a copy of a medicinal text known in Alexandria as the Treatise of Red Earth and Wind. Unfortunately, Alexandria's library catalogue listed it under a local idiom, and Pergamon received instead a comedic play about a drunken potter and his ill-fated love affair with a kiln. A clerical error, perhaps, but a highly entertaining one. Even corrections took time. Scribes had to recarve wax tablets, redip pens, and hold delicate parchment taut with wooden tensioners while they scraped away mistakes with tools resembling tiny bronze spatulas. Not the sort of luxury editing you'd see on a modern blog, but quite effective for removing both ink and one's sense of patience. And through these meticulous methods, bit by bit, the Pergamon library catalogue took shape, an amalgamation of language, logic, parchment, and passionate squinting. It was rarely flashy. It did not gleam or sing, but within it lay the cultural blueprints of knowledge, sorted and listed and painstakingly preserved behind painted wooden panels. Of course, no catalogue, however grand, is immune to polite confusion. One visiting scholar searching for a volume on herbal remedies accidentally retrieved an epic poem about garlic-induced love potions. But that's the charm of ancient libraries. They didn't just inform, they occasionally surprised. And who among us doesn't enjoy a little romantic misunderstanding set to the soothing scent of salted goat hide? Listen closely. Can you hear Diogenes muttering at his catalogue tablet even now? No. The onions of Sparta go next to the gastronomies of Antioch, not in the metaphysics section. A quiet librarian's lament that echoes softly through parchment corridors and time. Now, the torch is dim, casting buttery light across the calm rows of scrolls. All is quiet, save the distant flutter of parchment and a teasing yawn from the shadows. In the next breath of our dreamy journey, we'll drift across the Aegean Sea to another chest of cataloguing curiosities, where the stars above mirrored the inked symbols below. By the time the cataloguing candle had flickered its last in Pergamon, across the arid breezes of time and parchment, a new sort of quiet genius began emerging from a most unexpected quarter. Byzantine bureaucrats. Yes, the Byzantines, with all their golden mosaics, endlessly complicated religions, and serious love for bureaucracy, were surprisingly tender-hearted about alphabetizing vellum scrolls. As it turns out, nothing says imperial dignity quite like a listing of every surviving treatise on aromatic resins. You see, in the capital of Constantinople, thrumming and glittering on the edge of two continents, there was a slow-burning revolution in library management, one that didn't require armies or fire, but rather patience, ink, and the ability to copy tables for days on end without nodding off or, say, crying into your papyrus. Let's glide gently into the unassuming world of the patriarchal library, nestled in a wing of the great church of Hagia Sophia. No frescoes adorned it, no icon-clad drama, just room after peaceful room of ancient texts and catalogues maintained by ecclesiastical clerics who, if we're honest, probably relished the opportunity to escape choral practice. Here, under the flickering lamplight and the eternal vigilance of saints painted above their heads, monks and scribes painstakingly logged religious texts and commentaries onto slender codices. These codices weren't merely repositories of Greek Christian thought. They became master indexes, elegantly listing which works sat where, who wrote them, when they were copied, and under which emperor's indulgent rule. Oh, and there was nothing casual about these lists. The Byzantines didn't do casual. These fellows catalogued with the fervour of someone trying to win eternal salvation by way of footnotes. Alphabetical order, naturally. The Greek alphabet, rotated 4 times and interpolated with diacritical symbols, allowed for a sorting system so precise it could separate 2 treatises on apostolic virtue based on whether the author sneezed while writing. Want to find St. Gregory Nazianzus' 39th oration? It's filed under Gamma. Unless it's the 11th century Vesper redaction, then it's under Delta Sigma Lambda. Don't ask. But what made Byzantine cataloguing particularly dreamy, yes, dreamy, was how they leaned into metadata before metadata was cool. They didn't just note down the title and author. They included scribe traditions, manuscript provenance, marginalia history, and, where possible, a polite accusation about which earlier monks had copied things with less than graceful penmanship. In one deeply adorable instance, a catalogue entry adds a note that the previous binding was of red goatskin, removed after accidental emulsioning with honey, which, for the record, we believe may involve either overly enthusiastic sacramental wine or a very small, very curious bear. Catalogues themselves became heirlooms. They were copied, glossed, annotated, then recopied with annotations on the annotations. Some grew to include entire family trees of manuscript copies, like little genealogies of ink trailing back through centuries of scholarly devotion and probably sore wrists. And then, in a fit of early cross-indexing brilliance, the 10th century Byzantine emperor Constantine VII, known for his love of learning and for writing things practically no one could read, commissioned a vast summary of older knowledge, titled Excerpta. It was a sort of literary buffet. History, politics, ethics, all conveniently arranged, extracted, and indexed. Scholars still don't know how many volumes were made, though rumour has it that carrying the full set could result in mild heel injuries. Those who worked on it were said to be men of elegance and steadiness of hand, traits deeply prized in an empire whose other major output at the time was theological debate so complex it made your average tax code look like haiku. Just imagine the late-night hum of Constantinople. Distant torches shimmering off marble, the soft scratching of styluses over parchment, and somewhere, in a quiet alcove of the patriarchal archives, a sleepy scribe exhaling through his nose as he carefully corrects a mislabeled commentary on the Book of Job. It was humble, yes, tedious, often, but it was a gift to time. Paper breadcrumbs leading forward into the unknown. In the comforting hush of Byzantine night, with the Bosphorus whispering its silk-smooth lull at the city's edge, the spreadsheets of eternity were quietly being updated, line by line, soul by soul. And over in a dusty corner, behind a half-hidden curtain, something remarkable was stirring in a monastery even older than this empire. Something that involved Irish monks, Latin charms, and a cowhide binding with a sense of drama. We'll drift there next. By the time we arrive in 12th century Song dynasty China, the art of cataloguing had taken on a distinctly measured elegance, like calligraphy with facts instead of strokes. Here, beneath the scroll-brushed rooftops and willow-shaded courtyards, a quiet revolution in information management was underway, motivated not by conquest or profit, but by a sincere devotion to wisdom, and perhaps, at times, to showing off just how many scrolls you could stack in an aesthetically pleasing fashion. Let's take a midnight stroll into the Imperial Library of Kaifeng, capital of the Northern Song. A place so serene, even the dust motes floated in alphabetical alignment. This wasn't simply a jar of bamboo strips in a monastery corner. No, this was a sprawling complex of literary ambition. The emperor's scholars were amassing texts in every subject from Confucian interpretation to the practical uses of mulberry bark, because you never know when your silk production might spike suddenly. But the crown jewel of this bibliographic sanctuary was not just the books. No, what whispered history into the moonlit rafters was how those scrolls were stored, retrieved, and above all, remembered. They had catalogue lists, glorious, immaculate catalogue lists. Song librarians developed indexing systems based on multiple classifications, subject, author, even the rhythmic structure of titles. Some listed texts by their first and last characters. Others used the dynasty of origin as a sortable field. It was like Excel spreadsheets before spreadsheets existed, only much more fragile and more elegant. And there were no accidental Ctrl plus Zs, only long pauses of regret after knocking over an ink jar. In particular, the bibliographic treatises found in Song Dynasty histories were remarkable. These detail not only what books existed in the imperial library, but how they were grouped, copied, edited, lost, and occasionally rediscovered at yard sales or along riverbanks after ambitious fishing trips. One librarian named Zheng Qiao went so far as to write an entire philosophical essay on record-keeping itself. He mused that categorizing knowledge was essential to rectifying names, a nod to Confucius's idea that misunderstanding arises when things are called by the wrong label. You see, for Zheng Qiao, correctly filing a book wasn't just practical, it was a moral duty. It's comforting, really, to imagine a medieval scribe stroking his beard, contemplating the subtle difference between agriculture and horticulture, while somewhere outside, merchants crowded the streets and dumplings steamed in bamboo baskets. The Song Dynasty also gave us the 4 great books of song, an enormous cataloguing endeavor that tried to codify every important piece of Chinese literature and knowledge to date. Think of them as the ancient ancestor of your college reading list, but massive, sprawling, and engraved with a level of reverence usually reserved for sacred relics and particularly nice tea. One of these was the Taiping Guangji, an anthology of more than 7,000 supernatural tales. Librarians had to decide, does this go under fiction, history, spiritual studies, or simply things that go bump over tea? The classification discussions must have been legendary and rather slow. Of course, like every great archival effort in world history, entropy always lurked just beyond the scroll rack. Invasions, fires, bureaucratic reshufflings, books were lost, moved, reclassified, or occasionally consumed by mice with discerning literary palate. Some of the greatest losses were not due to war, but dampness. One monsoon could wipe out 3 decades of curated knowledge. Turns out, even the most organized librarian is no match for a determined puddle. Still, even with all those setbacks, the librarian scholars of the Song Dynasty laid a foundation of reverence for categorization, a meticulousness that whispered, "This matters, even if no one reads it today." Their approach was orderly but full of wonder, labeling chaos in pursuit of insight. Imagine now, gentle listener, the twilight hush of that ancient library, the hush of brushed silk robes swaying past lacquered shelves, of ink drying slowly beside a half-finished scroll, the quiet legacy of those who dared to name the world one careful column at a time. And as we gently close the parchment on this peaceful hour in Song China, let us drift softly toward another library not far away, one with secrets of its own filed between stone and silence. As Alexandria's golden light flickered against polished papyrus scrolls and shelves groaned under the weight of human pondering, our story takes an eastward drift toward the patient heart of Han Dynasty China, where categorization was philosophy as much as it was practicality. Here, cataloguing wasn't merely a dusty duty handled by underfed scribes with bad posture. It was a quiet art form, a reflection of cosmic order itself, handled by scholars in robes that whispered as they moved. Now, imagine you're a student in 1st century BCE Chang'an, the imperial capital. You've just hiked your way across town dodging ox carts, determined to visit the Imperial Library, a place known as the Tianlu Linlang, a resplendent hall dedicated not only to books, but to the very balance of heaven and earth. You enter through gates carved with dragons who look like they also need a nap, and are immediately struck by silence so thick, you're sure it's weighing down your ears. But this wasn't a library in the messy Western sense. No stacks of classified scrolls arranged next to woodcut bound cookbooks from rival provinces. Oh no, this was order personified. The imperial librarians, many of whom were Confucian scholars who secretly loved a good organizational chart, didn't just catalogue knowledge. They curated it according to the 5 phases: wood, fire, earth, metal, water, and the yin-yang dance of the cosmos. A text wasn't filed based just on its subject matter. It was filed according to its element, energy, and moral alignment. Possibly also how well it matched the librarian's mood that day. Librarian Liu Xiang, a man of remarkable patience and exceedingly neat brushwork, is credited with constructing one of China's earliest systematic bibliographies, the Bielu, a precise roll call of the empire's books compiled around 26 BCE. But Liu Xiang didn't just list titles and call it a day. He categorized and evaluated, offering commentary on authorship and authenticity, as though he were hosting a scholarly version of a talent show. This volume, though dense, is accurate, he might have said, with a solemn flourish of his long sleeve. This other, well, the bamboo strips were better used as kindling. He worked elbow deep in jumbled bundles of bamboo slips, sorting them like a genial ancient KonMari. If a work did not spark heavenly harmony, it was gently set aside, perhaps recycled into grocery lists or forgotten entirely next to someone's ancestral incense burner. Liu's son, Liu Xin, picked up the scroll where his father left off. He refined the system into what's known as the 7-part classification, which sorted texts into categories like classics, philosophy, poetry, military strategy, and history fans, grip your floppy pillow hats, miscellaneous. Now, you might think, miscellaneous sounds lazy, but to an ancient Chinese librarian, it was a thrillingly wild category, embracing such miscellanea as texts on dream interpretation, magic spells, and why your dog might be connected to your great uncle's karmic energy. It was the junk drawer of the literate world, and it was magnificent. But beyond the cosmic classification and commentary lay a quietly delightful detail. Book logs were sometimes kept on silk. Yes, actual silk, fabric that today might be reserved for fancy pajamas or dignified curtains, was once inked with the names of philosophy texts. Laozi's Way of Virtue, right next to Why the Seasons Change and How to Garden Accordingly. Smooth to the touch, and even smoother to read if you had the lantern light just right. And while these grand libraries were mostly reserved for imperial elites and scholarly types who thought long walks and even longer quotes were the height of fun, the ripple of their organization echoed far. The idea of books being a kind of system, of knowledge being ordered rather than chaotic, was taking root across the globe. But the meditative elegance of hand cataloguing mustn't be mistaken for dullness. These scholars believed that ordering books mirrored the ordering of society, of nature, even of your own thoughts. To sit with a scroll, to know exactly where it belonged, what it represented, and how it fit into the cosmos, was an act of balance. So yes, even filing could be philosophical, especially if your filing system included the wind, the stars, and an early dinner of steamed dumplings. Rest easy now, as the silk scrolls are gently rolled up for the evening. The scent of sandalwood mingles with ink. Tomorrow night, we'll drift west again, to see how troublingly enthusiastic monks once labelled their libraries by candlelight, with a flair for magnanimous misfiling. Meanwhile, on the quieter edges of history, just past the philosophers, loafing somewhere between scribes and sleepy-eyed monks, you'll find a little-known hero of early cataloguing, the humble bookworm. Not the metaphorical kind who glows with intellectual curiosity, mind you, but actual book-chewing larvae, the kind whose idea of leisure was munching their way through papyrus like it was a 7-course tasting menu. Now, most sources of knowledge don't start with insects, but the history of ancient library cataloguing practically invites such unlikely stars. For in this particular chapter of human brilliance and bureaucracy, it was often the pests, both pestilent and two-legged, that guided custodians of knowledge toward more effective systems of order. After all, if you've just discovered that your precious scroll of the Epic of Gilgamesh now ends with an unexpected hole the size of a chickpea, you're going to suddenly care quite a lot about how many copies you have, and in what cupboard you put the one that's still legible. Thus, ancient cataloguing was never just a technical exercise. It was quite often a battle of wits between the scholars, the scrolls, and the slow but tenacious team termite. In the great scholarly centres like Pergamon and Alexandria, cataloguing had already blossomed into its own quiet art, somewhere between list-making and bibliography, with a dash of poetry and a sprinkle of obsession. But far beyond those luminous halls, in more provincial libraries, the ones with fewer columns and more wobbly stools, librarians had to get creative. No marble bas-reliefs here, no golden bust of Homer watching over the catalogue desk. No, instead, one might find a dusty clay shelf labelled by a system known only to its maker, usually something like important but untitled, scrolls that mention cows, or my personal favourite, not actually interesting, but donated by the priest's aunt, so please pretend. We must not forget that in these libraries, the role of the librarian was equal parts scholar, detective, and janitor. Keeping knowledge organised was not just about tidy shelving. It was about interpretation, diplomacy, and locating the one scroll that someone swore they saw 5 years ago during a sandstorm, and somewhat possibly remembered the title beginning with "the." There's evidence suggesting that some librarians resorted to acoustic methods of identification. That's right, they would gently knock against the rolled up papyrus or parchment, listening to the sound it made when tapped. Hollow ones might be newer, denser scrolls might have more text, and the soggy sounding ones, well, hopefully just water, hopefully. Even colour played a role. Some cataloguers tried to dye the ends of their scrolls, blues for philosophy, red for poetry, green for don't bother. Though of course over time the dyes faded, changed shade, or bled onto the shelf beneath, occasionally causing confusion about whether Democritus was a philosopher or a mould enthusiast. And then, in certain far-off corners, a delightful invention was whispered into being: the idea of shelf lists, literal stone or wooden tablets listing the contents of a shelf, attached by string or nail. Simple, practical, and just heavy enough to discourage theft, or at least make the thief drop it halfway down the road and flee dramatically into a vineyard. One deeply weathered record from the Hellenistic period notes a librarian who implemented a double tag system: one tag on the scroll, one on the shelf, and, get this, even a third tag hanging from the librarian's own belt in case of confusion. For a while, it worked beautifully, until the librarian hosted a toga party, got slightly over-ambitious with the wine, and awoke to find 36 scrolls labelled Hector's Stew Recipe. And yet, amid all this chaos, a wider logic was blossoming. The idea that knowledge could be mapped, catalogued, navigated, not just stored in piles like wool or grain, but carefully placed within the architecture of human understanding. Even if half the scrolls had questionable handwriting, even if mice occasionally turned Aristotle into mulch, there was a glimmering belief that wisdom was worth organizing. These early efforts might seem quaint now, but even clay tablets with squiggled markings were the ancient world's proto-search engines. They carried the same hope: to find the right words in the right order at just the right moment. And so, as acrid oil lamps flicker low in forgotten reading chambers and cracked fingers make one final note in pumice dust, we drift softly forward to the threshold of an unexpected revolution, one no longer written on papyrus, but on parchment, bound and whispering of something altogether new. As the candle of our long and yawning journey flickers its final glow, we find ourselves in the dustiest corner of the ancient world, where silence wore sandals and wisdom smelled faintly of papyrus. Picture, if you will, a lone librarian in the stillness of closing time. Somewhere in the twilight of the ancient Mediterranean, perhaps in a back chamber of Alexandria's great library, he nudges closed a scroll rack with the precise solemnity of a priest sealing a sarcophagus. His clay tablet catalogue, scratched neatly in fading Greek, rests beside him like a faithful cat. An inventory compiled not from algorithms or QR codes, but from memory, ink, and very patient handwriting. The task of organizing knowledge, then as now, remained a sublime act of loving futility. Every time you indexed a scroll of herbal remedies alphabetically by ailment, someone donated another copy with updated notes on the slippery moral character of valerian root. Scrolls multiplied like a philosopher's footnotes, uninvited, intricate, and always slightly contradictory. Over time, librarians learned to accept the chaos. Some even relished it. The Stoics believed cosmic order was governed by reason, but I'll wager none of them ever tried to reshelve Sophocles after it was misfiled under jokes accidental. Behind the grand myths and golden statues, behind the chants of priests and proclamations of kings, it was these gentle cataloguers, tucked in candlelit corners, who quietly tamed the world's ideas, not by seizing glory, but by labeling it carefully, repeatedly, and preferably in 3 cross-reference systems. The quietest revolution in history may well have been the foot race between information overload and innovative shelving. As parchment and papyrus grew more plentiful, with every dynasty keen to inscribe their own definitive, complete, and authoritative history of absolutely everything, especially us, librarians faced a bureaucratic tidal wave. Some responded with philosophical elegance. In India, Buddhist monastic libraries developed meticulous palm leaf cataloguing systems, often memorialized in verse, to make them easier to chant and harder to misplace. Picture a monk rapping softly about where to locate the Lotus Sutra, and you're halfway there. Others adapted with sheer clerical defiance. In the Islamic Golden Age, vast translation movements in Baghdad's House of Wisdom saw Greek, Sanskrit, and Persian texts layered into Arabic libraries. There, scribes color-coded volumes, copied marginalia like divine footnotes, and even stuck written instructions on scroll storage. Ancient post-its, if you will. And then there were the wandering scholars of China, who packed their mobile shelves and roamed the empire like intellectual caravans, exchanging annotated Confucius for updated commentaries on agriculture, astronomy, and poems about plums. It all sounds deeply impressive, until you remember that many of these systems were entirely reliant on people remembering where they put things. A library catalogue, after all, was only as good as its last user. One slightly distracted philosopher, fresh from a metaphysical breakthrough or a mildly fermented lunch, could derail years of order. Thus, many scrolls travelled without moving at all, hidden 3 layers deep in a pigeonhole, falsely labelled as fishing manuals, and untouched for centuries because someone mistook Plato for pickled sardines. And so, as the candle gutters low, the great and silly truth becomes clear. Much of what we know survives because someone somewhere thought to write it down and then told someone else where they put it, perhaps with a note, ideally with a backup note, maybe even a tag in ancient equivalent of all caps. Do not misplace, important. And while countless scrolls were lost to fire, flood, or poorly positioned goats, many were preserved, not because of kings or conquerors, but thanks to librarians who believed the world made more sense if it had a quietly labelled drawer. So now, as your eyelids lower like shutters in a quiet scriptorium, let your thoughts drift slowly among the shelves of time. Let the gentle rustle of imaginary scrolls lull you. Somewhere, perhaps just outside the dreamscape, a scroll labelled "The Lost Wisdom of the Ancients" patiently waits to be refiled, somewhere between philosophy and recipes. Sleep well, dear listener. The library is closed,